His main motive was, presumably, to maximize his personal power. During World War II, Stalin emerged, after an unpromising start, as the most successful of the supreme leaders thrown up by the belligerent nations. In August 1939, after first attempting to form an anti-Hitler alliance with the Western powers, he concluded a pact with Hitler, which encouraged the German dictator to attack Poland and begin World War II. Anxious to strengthen his western frontiers while his new but palpably treacherous German ally was still engaged in the west, Stalin annexed eastern Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Romania. He also attacked Finland and extorted territorial concessions. In May 1941, Stalin recognized the growing danger of the German attack on the Soviet Union by appointing himself chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, head of the government. It was his first governmental office since 1923. Stalin's pre-war defensive measures were exposed as incompetent by the German blitzkrieg that surged deep into Soviet territory after Hitler's unprovoked attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Khrushchev claimed that Stalin was shocked into temporary inactivity by the onslaught, but, if so, he soon rallied and appointed himself supreme commander-in-chief. When the Germans menaced Moscow in the winter of 1941, he remained in the threatened capital, helping to organize a great counteroffensive. The Battle of Stalingrad, in the following winter, and the Battle of Kursk, in the summer of 1943, were also won by the Soviet army under Stalin's supreme direction, turning the tide of invasion against the retreating Germans, who capitulated in May 1945. As a war leader, Stalin maintained close personal control over the Soviet battlefronts, military reserves, and war economy. At first over-inclined to intervene with inept telephoned instructions, as Hitler did, the Soviet generalissimo gradually learned to delegate military decisions. Stalin participated in high-level Allied meetings, including those of the Big Three with Churchill and Roosevelt at Tehran, 1943, Yalta, 1945, and Potsdam, 1945. A formidable negotiator, he outwitted these foreign statesmen. His superior skill has been acclaimed by Anthony Eden, then British Foreign Secretary. After the war, Stalin imposed on Eastern Europe a new kind of colonial control based on native communist regimes nominally independent but in fact subservient to himself. He thus increased the number of his subjects by about 100 million. But in 1948, the defection of Titoist Yugoslavia from the Soviet camp struck a severe blow to world communism as a Stalin-dominated monolith. To prevent other client states from following Tito's example, Stalin instigated local show trials, manipulated like those of the Great Purge of the 1930s in Russia, in which satellite communist leaders confessed to Titoism, many being executed. Far from continuing his wartime alliance with the United States and Great Britain, Stalin now regarded these countries, especially the United States, as the archenemies that he needed after Hitler's death. At home, the primacy of Marxist ideology was harshly reasserted. Stalin's chief ideological hatchet man, Andrei Zhdanov, a secretary of the Central Committee, began a reign of terror in the Soviet artistic and intellectual world. Foreign achievements were derided. And the primacy of Russians as inventors and pioneers in practically every field was asserted. Hopes for domestic relaxation, widely aroused in the Soviet Union during the war, were thus sadly disappointed. Increasingly suspicious and paranoid in his later years, Stalin ordered the arrest, announced in January 1953, of primarily Jewish Kremlin doctors on charges of medically murdering various Soviet leaders, including Zhdanov. The dictator was evidently preparing to make this doctor's plot the pretext for yet another great terror menacing all his senior associates, but he died suddenly on March 5, according to the official report. So convenient was this death to his entourage that suspicions of foul play were voiced. Legacy of Joseph Stalin, a politician to the marrow of his bones, Stalin had little private or family life, finding his paramount relaxation in impromptu buffet suppers, to which he would invite high party officials, generals, visiting foreign potentates, and the like. Drinking little himself on these occasions, the dictator would encourage excessive indulgence in others, thus revealing weak points that he could exploit. He would also tease his guests, jocularity and malice being nicely balanced in his manner, for such bluff banter Stalin's main henchman, Vyacheslav Molotov, the stuttering foreign minister, was often a target. Stalin had a keen, ironical sense of humor, usually devoted to deflating his guests rather than to amusing them. Foremost among Stalin's accomplishments was the industrialization of a country that, when he assumed complete control in 1928, was still notably backward by comparison with the leading industrial nations of the world. By 1937, after less than a decade's rule as a totalitarian dictator, he had increased the Soviet Union's total industrial output to the point where it was surpassed only by that of the United States. The extent of this achievement may best be appreciated if one remembers that Russia had held only fifth place for overall industrial output in 1913 and that it after that suffered many years of even greater devastation through World War, Civil War, famine, and pestilence than afflicted any of the world's other chief industrial countries during the same period. Yet more appallingly ravaged during World War II, the Soviet Union was nevertheless able, under Stalin's leadership, to play a significant part in defeating Hitler while maintaining its position as the world's second most powerful industrial and now military complex after the United States. In 1949, Stalinist Russia signaled its arrival as the world's second nuclear power by exploding an atomic bomb. Against these formidable achievements must be set one major disadvantage. Though a high industrial output was indeed achieved under Stalin, very little of it ever became available to ordinary Soviet citizens in the form of consumer goods or amenities of life. A considerable proportion of the national wealth, a proportion wholly unparalleled in the history of any peacetime capitalist country, was appropriated by the state to cover military expenditure, the police apparatus, and further industrialization. It is also arguable that a comparable degree of industrialization would have come about in any case surely by means less savage under almost any conceivable regime that might have evolved as an alternative to Stalinism. Stalin's collectivization of agriculture did not produce positive economic results remotely comparable to those attained by Soviet industry. Considered a means of asserting control over the politically recalcitrant peasantry, however, collectivization justified itself and continued to do so for decades, remaining one of the dictator's most durable achievements. Moreover, the process of intensive urbanization, as instituted by Stalin, continued after his death in what still remained a population more predominantly rural than that of any other major industrial country. In 1937, 56% of the population was recorded as engaged in agriculture or forestry. By 1958 that proportion had dropped to 42%, very largely as a result of Stalin's policies. Another of the dictator's achievements was the creation of his elaborately bureaucratized administrative machinery based on the interlinking of the Communist Party, ministries, legislative bodies, trade unions, political police, and armed forces, and also on a host of other meshing control devices. During the decades following the dictator's death, these continued to supply the essential management levers of Soviet society, often remaining under the control of individuals who had risen to prominence during the years of the Stalinist terror. But the element of total personal dictatorship did not survive Stalin in its most extreme form. One result of his death was the resurgence of the Communist Party as the primary center of power. After years during which that organization, along with all other Soviet institutions, had been subordinated to a single man's whim. Yet, despite the great power wielded by Stalin's successors as party leaders, they became no more than dominant figures within the framework of a ruling oligarchy. They did not develop into potentates responsible to themselves alone, such as Stalin was during his quarter of a century's virtually unchallenged rule. That Stalin's system persisted as long as it did, in all its major essentials, after the death of its creator is partly due to the very excess of severity practiced by the great tyrant. Not only did his methods crush initiative among Soviet administrators, physically destroying many, but they also left a legacy of remembered fear so extreme as to render continuing post-Stalin restrictions tolerable to the population. The people would have more bitterly resented, might even, perhaps, have rejected such rigors, had it not been for their vivid recollection of repressions immeasurably harsher. Just as Hitler's wartime cruelty toward the Soviet population turned Stalin into a genuine national hero, making him the Soviet Union's champion against an alien terror even worse than his own. So, Stalin's successors owed the stability of their system in part to the comparison, still fresh in many minds, with the far worse conditions that were obtained during the despot's sway. Stalin has arguably made a greater impact on the lives of more individuals than any other figure in history. But the evaluation of his overall achievement still remains decades after his death, a highly controversial matter. Historians have not yet reached any definitive consensus on the worth of his accomplishments. And it is unlikely that they ever will. To the American scholar George F. Kennan, Stalin is a great man, but one great in his incredible criminality. A criminality effectively without limits, while Robert C. Tucker, an American specialist on Soviet affairs, has described Stalin as a 20th-century Ivan the Terrible. To the British historian E. H. Carr, the Georgian dictator appears as a ruthless, vigorous figure, but one lacking in originality, a comparative nonentity thrust into greatness by the inexorable march of the Great Revolution that he found himself leading. To the late Isaac Deutscher, the author of biographies of Trotsky and Stalin who, like Carr, broadly accepts Trotsky's version of Stalin as a somewhat mediocre personage, Stalin represents a lamentably deviant element in the evolution of Marxism. Neither Deutscher or Carr has found Stalin's truly appalling record sufficiently impressive to raise doubts about the ultimate value of the Russian October Revolution's historic achievements. To such views may be added the suggestion that Stalin was anything but a plodding mediocrity, being rather a man of superlative, all-transcending talent. His special brilliance was, however, narrowly specialized and confined within the single crucial area of creative political manipulation, where he remains unsurpassed. Stalin was the first to recognize the potential of bureaucratic power, while the other Bolshevik leaders still feared their revolution being betrayed by a military man. Stalin's political ability went beyond tactics, as he was able to channel massive social forces both to meet his economic goals and to expand his personal power. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If so, hit or smash the subscribe button and turn on notification to be the first person to be notified whenever we post a new video. Your subscription won't be taken for granted.